Hey guys, I'm Eric, and this is part 2 of the Intro to ZBrush series. In the first video, we took a look at the basics of the ZBrush UI, we looked at basic navigation, and how to create an object. Now we're going to pretty much pick up where we left off in that video, so if you haven't checked out that video yet, I would recommend going to that one first, and I'll put a link to that up here. Once you've watched that video, this one will make a lot more sense. We're going to briefly recap some of the things we went over in that video, and then we're going to build upon them in this one. So check that one out first. And why don't we go ahead and jump right back into ZBrush and pick up where we left off. So in the last video, what we did was we drew our mesh on the canvas, we hit edit, and then we turned it into a poly mesh. This time what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and hit edit or key on your keyboard, and we're going to come down to initialize on the right hand side. You'll see that towards the bottom. Expand that menu and you'll see some options. Go ahead and take some time to play with those settings. You can squish your mesh in any direction, so you have X, Y, and Z. You can control the coverage of your mesh. Make sure that you reset those settings if you're playing around with them. And then you have the amount of polygons in your mesh. So by default, these are the settings, but you can drag this to be lower or higher. So we can simplify it so we don't have as many edge loops in our sphere. You can also hit Shift F or polyfill to actually see the topology of this object. And that just kind of gives you a better idea of what you're doing. So, you know, if you want like an 8x8 or a very specific amount of edge loops, this kind of helps you with that. So once you're happy, we can now go back up to make Polymesh 3D and convert this into a polymesh. Bam. And so that's also going to make a new subtool. And so now we have a polymesh version of our sphere. And any new subtools we make are always going to get added to this tool menu, so keep that in mind. Let's talk a little bit about sculpting. Now, by default, you can see in our left-hand menu, we have the standard brush selected. When we looked at these brushes before, they were all grayed out, but now if you go ahead and click that menu, you'll see these are all the different brushes that come with ZBrush, and each one does something different. A lot of them you might never even use, and over time there's going to be ones that become your favorite. And we can talk a little bit about which ones I like to use and why. For now, let's just stick to the standard brush. And you can actually go ahead and play with your brush and see that we're actually changing the geometry of this mesh. Now, like we went over in the last video, up top, you have your draw size, your Z intensity, which is how intense that brush is. So if we crank that all the way up, you'll see we're making big changes. If we crank it down, we're not affecting it at all. We have Z add and Z sub. So Z add means that when you're pressing on your mesh with your pen, it's going to pull the geometry out. And if we hold Alt on our keyboard and we start drawing, we're going to push that geometry in. All Z add means is what is the default mode for your brush. So if we had Z sub selected, by default we would push in and it would have to press Alt to pull out. I mean, there's not really any reason to switch that. Maybe you might find a use for it, but I pretty much always just keep it on Z add and just use Alt when I want to go in. So there's a quicker way to get to these menus. You can actually just right click and it's going to bring up a menu directly under your brush. And that makes it a lot easier to work with when you're sculpting. So if you're scribbling, you can actually just right click that and affect the draw size, the Z intensity, that sort of thing. We also have focal shift. And that can have an impact on how your brush kind of draws. So if you have like an alpha applied to your brush, it's going to kind of impact the fall off of that brush. And it's hard to put into words, but you kind of just have to play with it and you'll see what it does. But you know, you can kind of just keep it at like a middle. I usually don't keep it right at 0, but maybe a little bit negative. You'll find what works for you. Now, before we go any further, let's take a look at history in ZBrush. So, like most software, you can hit Ctrl-Z to undo. Now, what you might notice is this bar up here, as we're undoing, this highlighted area is going back in time. And this is actually a timeline of our history in ZBrush. So you can click and drag this in either direction and see our changes. So we can go forward and redo all of our changes. We can go back and reverse all of our changes. Now, say we go back a few steps and we start drawing again, it's going to delete everything past that point and create new history going forward. So you can't retain the history that's ahead of your undo that you have currently selected, but you'll retain everything before that. And this is really useful, and oftentimes I'll actually just like scroll back just to kind of see where I was and where I'm at now, and if and basically get an idea of if I like the direction that I'm going in. It's almost like a time lapse of your sculpting. Granted, if you have a really dense mesh and you've been working for a long time, that does start to get slow, so be careful. Right now we're going to go ahead and undo everything and get back to the default state. The next thing I want to show you is a couple of the buttons we skipped over on this right hand menu last time. For example, by default, our camera is orthographic, and you can actually snap to different ortho views by holding shift and dragging in space. So we can actually like rotate and then hold shift and it'll snap. And you'll actually see in the top right here, we've got this little face that's kind of showing the direction that you're facing. You know, so you can kind of know which way you're looking by just referring to that little head up there. And you can also click these arrows to snap to different perspectives. So you can like double tap it in a direction and like flip it, for example, or we can look up or down, that sort of thing. So we're looking at the top of it, now we're looking at the bottom of it, forward, backwards. And that's just a way to like hop around your mesh and just kind of keep track of what direction you're looking. Now, at some point, once you start sculpting maybe characters or heads or something, you're more than likely going to want to have perspective on to get a more accurate feel of how your mesh looks through a real camera. And you'll see right here we have dynamic perspective, and you can turn that on. You can also hit P on your keyboard, and that's going to give our camera perspective so you can see the change. Suddenly it feels a little more bulbous, like it's pushing out towards us. That's going to be really important. You're going to be toggling perspective on and off a lot as you're trying to read your mesh and feel the shapes in 3D space. So keep that in mind. Now you can also control the intensity of the perspective by going up to the draw panel up top here. So expand draw, and you'll see we have a whole section for our camera. And by default, the perspective of the camera is set to a 50mm lens. So if you're familiar with photography or videography or anything like that, you'll know, like, you know, 35mm, 50mm. 50 is actually a pretty good value, especially for heads. That's a very popular perspective for portrait photography. So is 85 if you're going for a really flat look. You know, and obviously the higher your focal length, the flatter your model's going to appear. You know, so if you're sculpting like 35 or 28 or 24, it's going to be really exaggerated. And you have to really think about that because, you know, if you're looking at somebody with like a 24mm lens, their ears are going to start to get lost behind their head because there's so much distortion happening. And then as you increase that focal length, it's going to get more and more flat. And that's just something really important, especially when you're looking at like reference or you're trying to sculpt a likeness. Considering the lens that picture was taken with is going to impact the proportions of your model. So that's always something you need to keep in mind. We're going to set it back to 50 for now though. The next thing that we want to take a look at is symmetry. Now, symmetry allows you to sculpt on both sides of your model at the same time. So to enable symmetry, you can go up to the transform panel and you'll see down here, activate symmetry. You can turn that on, and then you can control which axis your symmetry is going to be applied in. So for example, by default, it's on the X axis, and you can see now when we go to draw, it's affecting both sides. And, you know, say if you wanted to have it over here, you could turn on Z, and now we're affecting that. Or you could even do Y, and now we're affecting top to bottom. You can even have multiple axes selected at the same time, so we could turn on all three of these and be affecting multiple areas of the model all at once, symmetrically. The last thing in this menu to take note of is you can even do radial. So it actually will turn symmetry on in a radial pattern all the way around the model. And that's super cool. There's lots of like hard surface modeling things that you can use with that. There's also posable symmetry, which gets a little more complicated. You know, that's if you're trying to keep symmetry while posing your model. It can be very finicky, so we'll probably look at something like posable symmetry in its own video later on. We're going to skip it for now. Now, the other way to enable symmetry is X on your keyboard. You can hit X to turn it on or off. You will really want to pay attention to that because there's more times than I can count where I hit that key and sculpted for a while and realized I didn't have symmetry on, or vice versa, and I've totally got a lopsided mesh. There's ways to fix that, but it's always a little frustrating when you realize that you've accidentally hit X and affected your symmetry. So, yeah. Now, the next thing we want to take a look at is the transform tools. The transforms that we looked at previously were basically moving the mesh around in a fixed position without ever moving off axis. And you can see that if you go up to the menu here and turn floor on, you can actually see the mesh is staying put where that floor is, and we're just kind of rotating it around. But there's another way to move your object around, and this is something you'll use when you're adding details or moving things around on like a character or whatever you're working on, and that's the transform tool. And you'll notice next to our edit and draw settings, there's move, scale, and rotate. So if you go ahead and hit move, we're going to bring up a gizmo just like Maya or Max. This gizmo actually allows you to move the mesh off axis and put it anywhere you want in the scene. So you can translate it, you can rotate it, and you can scale it. You can click between these, but it's going to keep the same gizmo because this gizmo actually gives you all three options at once. There's also a whole lot of options that you can do once you have the gizmo selected. For example, if you had multiple objects in your scene, you could have them all move at the same time. You can also reset it, so that resets the gizmo to the origin. You can also center it to the center of the mesh. All I'm doing is hitting Alt and tapping, and it's applying that option. And it's pretty, you can see if you just mouse over these, it tells you what they can do. There's also a whole bunch of tools you can do within the gizmo that we won't go over in this video, but it unlocks a whole other world of customization and things you can do to your mesh. We're going to undo these options though for now. The last thing to note about the gizmo is that the hotkeys are W, E, and R to move between move, scale, and rotate. And believe it or not, the gizmo is actually a fairly new addition to Zbrush. It was added only maybe like 2 versions ago. I don't remember exactly, but before the gizmo, there was what was called the transpose tool. And you'll see this little button right here. If you turn that off, it brings this different way to move your mesh around. I don't really use this anymore. I don't think I've used it in a year or 2 now, but I just wanted to show you it just in case you were wondering what that button was. And it's just like a different way to interact with your mesh where you can draw this line out, and it's almost like a temporary joint. You can look up more about the transpose tool if you're interested in it, but I'll tell you right now, I have not used it in a long time, but maybe there's people out there that have a use for it and I just don't know about it. We're not going to worry about it for this video. So that's pretty much the overview of interacting with your mesh. Now we're going to go over a little bit about actually sculpting on it. And if you still have the move tool selected, you can go up and hit draw, and draw is going to move you back from the gizmo to your brush. You can also hit Q on your keyboard. So Q brings you to the draw mode, W brings you to move tool, Q brings you back. As you can see, we do not have a lot of geometry to sculpt. You surely couldn't sculpt a head with this amount of quads, for example. And this is where subdivisions come into play. And subdivisions are like the backbone of how you sculpt in Zbrush, and it's a very important concept to understand. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the geometry tab on the right hand side, and we're going to expand that. Now you're going to see this big button right here, divide. Go ahead and hit that, and you're going to see that our sphere gets a little more smooth, and we've basically added some more geometry. And you can see up in the top right, we have active points. That increases. So now we have more geometry. And let's turn off our wireframe. If you go and use sculpt on this, I'm going to turn symmetry on by hitting X on my keyboard. We have more to work with. You can hit this again, and now we have even more. And you can go up pretty much as many times as you want until your computer falls over crying. you can see that as we add more subdivisions, we add more points, and we have more granularity that we can sculpt with. Now, you'll also notice as we subdivided, we have up here SDiv, and that's your subdivision level. And you can actually drag this to go back down or to go back up. And what's important to know is that this is non-destructive. So we can go to our lowest subdiv level, draw, and then go back up. And you can see those changes stayed through all those subdivision levels. We can then scribble a little bit at subdivision 4, go back down, do a little bit, go back up, and all of those changes stayed. The reason this is such an important concept to understand is that as you're sculpting, you always want to go from big to small. So you want to focus on your large shapes, and then as you increase the subdivision levels, you're focusing more and more on your smaller shapes. The reason this is so important is that the more geometry you have to work with, the harder it is to change the overall shape smoothly. So it's much more difficult to get a nice even shape at a really high level as it is at a low level, because we have so few verts to work with. We only have to manipulate like 4 verts to get a curve here, whereas if we're trying to get a nice clean curve at subdivision 4, we have a lot more polys we have to try to manipulate. And as you sculpt, you'll quickly see trying to do big changes at high subdivision levels ends up turning out really blobby. You'll be smoothing a lot, that sort of thing. And overall, it's just a real pain in the ass. Now, since it's kind of cumbersome to go over to this menu every time you want to change a subdivision level, let's go over the hotkeys very quickly about how to do all of this. I'm going to undo all of my changes. We're going to drag that slider back to before we had any subdivision levels. There we go. Now, you can hit Control D to add a new subdivision. Control D. You can see that we've added number 2 up in the right. You can hit that again, Control D. Now we have 3 subdivision levels. To go back down your subdivision chain, you can hit Shift D. Shifty, shifty, and you can see that slider moving. To go back up your chain, you can just hit D. So Control D, add a new subdivision, Shift D, go down a subdiv, D, go up a subdiv. The difference between D and Control D is only going to go up to a pre-existing subdivision level. It's not going to create a new one. The only way to create a new one is to hit Control D. That's the basics of how you sculpt in Zbrush. Everything on top of that is tools to amplify and empower you to do even more stuff beyond just basically drawing on your mesh. Just knowing how to subdivide and sculpt with a brush, you can sculpt the head with just this method. Now that we know how to subdivide, let's go over some brushes that are really useful to sculpting. Now, by default, you have the standard brush, and the standard brush is okay. I'm actually going to subdivide a few times just so we can really see what these brushes are doing. We have the standard brush, and that's kind of just like a soft round brush, almost like in Photoshop. It's just a round brush, nothing fancy about it, and you can do a lot with it. And you can sit here and play around with it and basically sort of sculpt something out using just the standard brush, and you can do a lot. Now, like we went over before, you can hold Alt to push in, but there's another command that you can do to modify your stroke, and that's Shift. So if you hold Shift, your brush is going to turn blue, and that's smooth. And you can see in your brush panel, as we press Shift, it's actually changing that brush, and it's turning it into a smooth brush. So you can draw a stroke, smooth it out, draw a stroke, smooth it out, and as you learn to sculpt, you're going to kind of get this flow where you're building something up, smoothing it out a bit, building something up, smooth it out a bit. And you'll learn if you go too high in your subdivisions, it gets harder and harder to smooth. So like, say I try to like draw this shape, it's very difficult to smooth. And so I might go down a few subdivision levels, smooth this out, and then go back up, something like that. So you'll learn kind of your technique and how you prefer to work as you practice. I'll be honest, I almost never use the standard brush. It has its place, but there's brushes I like to use a lot more for sculpting, and we'll go over those. But first I want to show you what's maybe the most important brush in your toolkit, and that's called the Move brush. All right, we go over to our brush panel. You can either look for Move, or you can go ahead and hit M on your keyboard, and it's gonna only show you brushes that start with M. You'll also see there's a little panel up top here, and you can hit any letter in the alphabet and it'll show you brushes with that letter. So we're gonna come over here and go to Move. There's also Move Topological, there's different ones, but we're just gonna use Move. You can see after we selected the Move brush, it changed our brush in our panel over here, so we know that we have it selected. You can come over to your model, click and drag, and the Move brush basically lets us pull or push different parts of our mesh. So before we were actually drawing strokes, this grabs wherever you click and you can move that around. Pairing the Move tool with our subdivision levels is what's going to let us sculpt all the kind of different things that we want to sculpt. So if we go all the way back down to subdiv 1 and we change the draw size of our brush, just like we learned to, we can take our sphere, smooth it out, and we can actually use the Move tool to roughly shape our sphere into the shape of a head, for example. So we can kind of block out the silhouette of a head. Now this is why subdivisions are so important, because if we tried to do this at subdivision 5, it's going to be so difficult to kind of shape this without it getting really blobby and warbly. And so that's why we're doing it on a lower subdiv first. And I'm actually going to delete our higher ones for now. So you can go over here and go delete higher or delete lower. Those are going to completely delete the subdivision levels above or below where you're currently selected. So I'm just going to delete those and we're just going to start fresh. I'm also going to turn off floor because we don't really need the floor anymore. So we're just going to go ahead and shape this into the shape of a head a little bit, just the best you can. We're not going to spend too much time right now. The Move brush is also a great brush to kind of show you what that focal shift does. So if we turn the focal shift way up, you can see that we're grabbing like a much larger area of the mesh. Whereas if we turn the focal shift intensity all the way in the other direction, we're grabbing just a point. So it kind of affects the area that you're selecting with your brush. I usually kind of keep it, like I said, 0 to like -20, -30 around there. Like a sweet spot for me, but you'll find what works for you and what you like. Let's talk about a couple other brushes that I like to use. So we're going to go ahead and subdivide to the next subdivision level. Just for the purposes of showing you what the brushes do, I'm actually going to subdivide a couple more times so we have a little bit more geometry to work with and we can actually see what some of these brushes do. Now, my favorite brush that I use for almost every project is called the Clay Tubes brush. Let's go up here. You can hit C, and you can see right here the Clay Tubes brush. So I'm going to select that. The Clay Tubes brush is basically like a flat square brush, and you can see it even applied in alpha. That's a square. And I really like this brush because it kind of emulates sculpting on real clay. I feel like I can apply a bunch of strokes on top of one another and they're building up like clay would. So when I'm blocking out like phases or anatomy, this is basically the brush that I use. You can see basically just kind of scribbling with this brush and then smoothing it out. You can kind of build up forms really fast. And I like the control of a flat brush over the standard brush because I feel like I have a lot more control over the forms that I'm putting down. And then what I'll often do is I'll use that and then I'll switch over to our Move brush and I can adjust some of the forms that I started to place, that sort of thing. You'll also see as we start selecting more brushes, if you go to your brush panel, we have Quick Pick, and this is going to basically give you a lot of the brushes that you've used. So we have the Move brush up here now because we had used that, and we have Clay Tubes here, Other brushes that are really interesting, I mean, clay, you have clay buildup, you have trim dynamic is a brush that I really like to use for stylized work because it basically flattens out the mesh, and I really like that. Yeah, there's a ton of brushes in here. Definitely don't be afraid of this menu. Like, jump in here, try some different brushes, see what they do, and over time you're going to learn the brushes that you really like using. The last thing I want to go over in this video is materials. So we talked a little bit about materials before. I just want to show you this menu once again and what you can do with it. So like I said, I really don't like using this red material, and oftentimes once I make a new model, I'll go over here and change it to a basic material, or I'll change it to the basic material or some kind of gray, and you can do that by just coming over to the menu and selecting that material. So something like this just lets you see the forms a lot better, I think. Like I said, you can go online, download a lot of materials. Like, I have some materials over here that kind of look like clay that I really like using, and there's a whole bunch of different ones you can find, but something just like the basic material or a matte cap gray, you can't go wrong. It's going to be leaps and bounds better for visualizing your model than that red clay material. I don't know why that's the default material. It's something I've never understood. All right, and with that, that's pretty much the basics to sculpt something in ZBrush. With just understanding these subdivision levels, the different brushes, and smoothing, you can sculpt pretty much anything that you want. Now, there's going to be limitations to only having this many tools. Overall, you can spend some time now and actually, sculpt a face or sculpt something by using that move tool, using that clay buildup, smoothing it out, all that sort of thing. So I recommend you just kind of play around and have fun and get used to how it feels to actually scribble and sculpt in ZBrush. In the next video, I'm going to show you a couple of tools and tricks that are just going to help enhance this workflow and build upon some of what we talked about here. We're going to talk about having multiple subtools, and we're also going to look at some of the geometry modifying tools to help really push your ability to sculpt on an object. For now though, I hope you enjoyed this, and if you like this content and you're interested in learning ZBrush and you want to see more videos and more tutorials in this series, please consider subscribing. I appreciate you checking out the channel, and I'll see you in that next video.